Hi, everyone. My name is Bianca Garcia, and I am the Associate Conservator of Paintings at the Balboa Art Conservation Center. My pronouns are she, her, hers, or ella, and I will be your moderator for today's conversation. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am joining you from the ancestral homeland of the Kumeyaay Nation. Kumeyaay peoples continue to maintain their connection to and care for this land. Welcome to the second of 4 sessions for preserving Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx art, conversations in conservation. This program is a collaborative effort between the Balboa Art Conservation Center, the Centro Cultural de la Raza, and the many wonderful participants who have graciously agreed to join us throughout the month of April to open a dialogue on what art conservation and cultural preservation looks like for the Chicanx community. This program is funded by the California Humanities and the City of San Diego Commission for Arts and Culture. Before we begin, I would like to invite everyone to use the chat space to share all of your ideas and curiosities. Our goal for these conversations is not to find answers, but rather to instigate questions. We are in investigation mode, and meeting here today is an informal way to dialogue about some of these curiosities. Please share any additional questions or topics that come up as the conversations progress, and we will be compiling these into a kind of cabinet of curiosities and using them as a guide to inform what additional conversations, conferences, or gatherings need to happen to move this conversation forward. Needless to say, this is just the beginning. I also want to do a special shout out to the people at the Centro, and while we mean to all the people who make the Centro a successful place, I also mean the people who are literally physically at the Centro at this moment. Roberto Hernandez, who's chair of the Centro's board and a professor of Chicano studies at San Diego State University, has invited his Chicano studies students to join us in a collective viewing of this panel from the Centro. We are so happy that you're all joining us virtually, and please send us all your questions and comments. We'll begin compiling this document of curiosities after today and let it grow after each session to make it accessible to the public. These sessions are also being recorded and will be shared. Today's topic is Rasquachismo Beyond Aesthetics, the Sensibilities of Documentation in Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx Art. Rasquachismo is a term coined by beloved Chicano scholar Tomas Ybarra-Frausto, and it's defined as a Chicano aesthetic. It speaks to a culturally specific visual narrative as well as a mode of production. In its simplest terms, it means to make do with what has. In all its complexity, it validates and holds space for cultural and knowledge production as a site of resistance. For Chicano art and artists, this can mean an additive approach to a limitless vision in a world where scarcity and overconsumption are everyday experiences of living on occupied land. For conservators, finding ways to preserve cultural materials born of this aesthetic, Rasquachismo can present complex challenges. Joining us today, we have Berenice Badillo, who is a Chicana artist and founding member of women's border arts collective XoQUE. We also have Felicia Montes, Chicana Indigenous artist, activist, and founding director of Mujeres de Maiz. Morgan Wylder, my colleague, who's an associate conservator of paintings at the Balboa Art Conservation Center. And my also colleague, Leticia Gomez Franco, who's the executive director of the Balboa Art Conservation Center. We will explore how Rasquachismo is one of the many styles employed by Chicana, Chicano, and Chicanx artists, how the use of materials and processes can be a part of the artist's creative intention, and how documentation at the time of production can help create guidelines for the care and conservation of these pieces in the future. So I will take the time to read all your bios because you have done such amazing work, and I would love for our audience to know more about you. I will start with Berenice. Her pronouns are she, ella, and Berenice is a Spanish-speaking licensed marriage and family therapist, a board-certified art therapist, an illustrator, a public speaker, a community muralist, and multimedia artist. She's an immigrant from La Piedad in Michoacan, Mexico, and has found herself straddling intertwined cultural and subcultural identities her entire life. Berenice has worked in communities of socioeconomic need and strives to document and encourage the creation of communal cultural wealth through murals, sculpture, pop-up art galleries, and in the co-creation of counter stories. Badillo started her career as a community muralist, mentoring homeless youth. She co-created a monthly hip-hop event called Elemental that showcased the art of local youth and developed after-school programming that was recognized by the City of San Diego and the State of California. She has a MANA honoree, which is a Mexican American Women's National Association, in recognition for outstanding work and dedication to the community through arts and culture, and became a community fellow through the California Wellness Foundation Violence Prevention Initiative. Berenice has extensive experience working with people and issues of drug and alcohol use and severe mental health issues. Berenice identifies as a Chicana and utilizes art therapy and community art to co-create collective platforms where inequalities can be identified and explored, resulting in the validation of all their cultural perspectives not belonging to dominant society. Berenice believes that there is an importance in representation and hopes that the illustrations of Am I Blue or Am I Green, her first children's book, will serve to both amplify the voices of BIPOC and disseminate the stories and struggles of their community, where it can be witnessed on a grand scale. In utilizing art as a form of deep psychological healing, art becomes a vehicle of change that can be a powerful tool to not only heal oneself, but also a catalyst to heal a community one at a time. Oh, it's beautiful. Berenice is a Chicano art muralist, has a doctorate in art therapy, and her work has appeared in many galleries and group shows, including the Havana Biennale, Insight 97, and the Tamaro Contemporary Art Exhibit in Tokyo, Japan. Berenice is also a founding member of a women's border arts collective, XoQUE Art in Motion, that is determined to evoke change on how the US and Mexico border is portrayed and represented in the cultural imaginations. XoQUE commits to innovation and experimentation that is participatory, based on each artist and the community comes together as a puzzle that utilizes each unique strength to create hope in the future. Thank you so much for joining us today, Berenice. Next up, we have Felicia Orfeh Montes, who's director of Mujeres de Maiz and a college lecturer, and her pronouns are she, her, ella. Felicia is a Chicana Indigenous artist, activist, community and event organizer, an educator, a femc, a designer, a poet, a performer, a professor, and a practitioner of the healing arts, living and working in the Los Angeles area. Known throughout the Southwest as an established Chicana cultural worker of a new generation, she creates within LACC, El Mercado y Más, and La Botánica del Barrio, and is the founding director of Mujeres de Maiz. She has worked on various transnational art and organizing efforts, including works with the Zapatistas, Peace and Dignity Journeys, and La Red Chicana Indigenous. Felicia graduated with a BA from UCLA in World Arts and Cultures and with a minor in Chicanx Studies. She holds an MA in Chicanx Studies from Cal State Northridge and an MFA from Otis College in Art Design and Public Practice Art. In addition, she's an apprentice of Western Herbalism and a Mexican traditional medicine. You can check out her work at feliciamontes.com, and I'll be adding her website to our chat. Next up, we have Morgan Weiler, who, like I said, is a conservator of paintings at the Balboa Art Conservation Center, and her pronouns are she, her, hers. Morgan started at BACC as a Mellon Fellow in Paintings Conservation. After that, she became Assistant Conservator of Paintings and is now Associate Conservator. Morgan earned a dual undergraduate degree in Fine Art and Art History at Cornell University. And after university, she interned at different conservators specializing in paper, paintings, and historic interiors in New York City and Washington, D.C. She later received her graduate degree in conservation of easel paintings from the Courtauld Institute of Art at the University of London. During graduate school, Morgan interned in the Paintings Conservation Department at the Victoria and Albert Museum of London. Before her Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship at the Balboa Art Conservation Center, Morgan worked as the NEH Fellow in Paintings Conservation at the Chrysler Museum of Art in Norfolk, Virginia. Morgan is a professional associate with the American Institute for Conservation. At BACC, Morgan examines and treats a broad range of paintings from historic to contemporary, and also carries out technical analysis of cultural heritage objects. Her areas of interest include the conservation and technical study of 20th century painters, open access digital publications in the conservation and technical art history fields, and helping artists to better understand materials to support their artistic practices. Morgan is a co-founder and co-editor of Materia, the Journal of Technical Art History, an international open access peer-reviewed journal for technical art history. Her own research recently includes the materials and techniques of 20th century painters from Southern California. And then last but not least, We have Leticia Gomez-Franco, who is the Executive Director of the Balboa Art Conservation Center, and pronouns are she, her, ella. Leticia is an arts administrator, an advocate, and a cultural producer. Her work is rooted in the intersections of culture, representation, and social justice, all values that play a role in her position as Executive Director for BACC. She previously served as the Senior Arts and Culture Funding Manager for the City of San Diego, where she led the city's Art and Culture Funding Program, oversaw the development and implementation of professional development, technical assistance and capacity building to incubate and build capacity of artists and arts and culture organizations, and supported the department's diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Before that, she served as Director of Programs for the New Americans Museum, where she supported the grand reopening of the Immigrant Narratives-based institution and led curatorial efforts. Her career in the arts began as Exhibitions Director for Casa Familiares The Front, a collaborative arts, culture, design, and urbanism, where she oversaw development and program management for multiple art spaces, as well as headed a rigorous and culturally conscious exhibition calendar with a commitment to local arts, diversity, and community empowerment. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of California, Berkeley in English and Chicano Studies, and a Master of Arts in Curatorial Theory from San Diego State University's Liberal Arts and Sciences program. She is also a two-time fellow of the National Association of Latino Arts and Culture Leadership Institute, or NALAC. Leticia remains steadfast in her commitment to use her experience in art administrations, development, and curating to increase access to the arts for all communities. What an excellent roster we have here. So starting with today's panel, I'm gonna ask a few questions, and Felicia and Berenice, we are really honored to have you here today to chat with us about Chicana art and preservation. You're both artists, scholars, and healers, and you both bring so much into your own work. We are excited to explore another intersection today between Chicanx culture production and art conservation, and we're gonna start with the idea of Rasquachismo. We're gonna explore Rasquachismo through 3 different angles, and Fem, Berenice, we'd love to hear your insights on these. So I'm gonna ask the question, and I'll start with one of you, and then the following can answer the same question. So first of all, can you tell us about Rasquachismo, its history and its meaning? And we're gonna start this one with Fe.
First of all, hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Felicia Montes, the Goyotzin to many within ceremonial and other circles, spaces. I am coming to you from Tongva territory, Los Angeles, specifically Elysian Park, and the community that has found and connected with much change and transition at this time. I wanted to connect and specifically talk about Rasquachismo connected to Mujeres and Maiz in a lot of our spaces and circles. And so from my connection and understanding, I learned a lot about it through college, but really feel like I lived it all my life, right? So being able to connect with it with Chicano studies classes, and specifically Chicana art classes, the first time I kind of connected and heard with Rasquachismo, specifically with our beloved and connected Tomas Ybarra-Frausto. No? And for myself, when I was listening to it and hearing about it, it was like connecting to the do-it-yourself aesthetic, the a la brava aesthetic, right? And even the word a la brava, or even trying to say that, right? Like, how do you translate that? Like, I just translate it into another Spanish word, like a la huevo, a la con ovario, o sea, like, what's the different maneras to say that, right? But more than anything, it's seen as how we do things on our own. For me, what we have, doing things, you know, from an underdog working class aesthetic. And when we say underdog, like los de abajo, los de abajo, and I want to add to that, y a la izquierda, because I come from Zapatista upbringing and consciousness and connection. And so for me, as an Indigenous person, as a Chicana Indigenous person in Tongva territory, understanding what that means, using what we can around us, the plants, the comida, whatever we have to make through. Now, this oftentimes for me, like I was telling somebody what I was going to do for today, the panel, and they were like, but doesn't that mean like negative? Like what? Like, isn't that, what are you going to talk about that for? Right. And they're not a Chicano artist. They do know about Chicano art, but they were already kind of like, isn't that like bad? Like talking bad about somebody? And I was like, yeah, it connects to the term even Chicano and the reclaiming of it. So for me, it's a lot of seen even often, oftentimes before kind of as a slur or rasquache, that idea like messy, but for us reclaiming that idea, reclaiming the connection to doing things according to how we can do it and what with what we have. You know, it might not be an official translation or official kind of definition, yeah, it's exactamente from Tomas Ybarra-Frausto, but for me, it's what I connect with, what I feel, and a lot of what our work is. So, muchas gracias.
Oh my gosh, I loved your term con ovarios. That just, yeah. And I think Rasquachismo, it really is about this feeling of empowerment and just, like you said, making do with what we have, and we can make it. Berenice, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for the invite. I think Rasquachismo, I was born into it. You know, I'm an immigrant, a child of immigrants, and I could remember my dad like fixing stuff with duct tape. Like, why call the mechanic? Why call the plumber? Like, we can do it, we'll figure it out, no pasa nada. And so I think that it's so important, this word, this concept, because how do we have access to things that we may not have access to? And I think that this term is really important because you have to be really creative. How amazing for you to figure something out when you don't have the thing or the resource. I mean, it's resilience, right? You build grit and resilience and resistance. I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna have it. I'm gonna go up, over, under, through the window, from the side, but it's gonna happen. And so for me, there's nothing more meaning than when I painted my mural in Chicano Park. I painted that mural with house paint. I went and asked a bunch of artists, you know, how do you paint a mural? And, you know, I talked to really wonderful artists like Judy Baca, who's amazing, but you know, she told me, hey, take my class and you need this and you need that. And I appreciate her time, but I wanted to do it with no resource. And so ultimately that painting was done in canvas. There wasn't any mural painting there. My mentor showed me that you can do whole installations with rosin paper, which is this brown paper that painters use, and duct tape, of course. So I think that it's really important as a way of getting things done. And even as an art therapist working with communities, what do we have? We don't have this expensive thing, but we have bubble paint, we have this. How do you create something? Like I remember going to Cuba and they have nothing, but their artwork is just the most impactful because they are creating something out of nothing. And that I think is the essence of we will do it. It will be amazing. And look how we're doing it.
Thank you so much. So let's talk about Rasquache as an aesthetic. What are some of the visual and aesthetic values that are present in Rasquachismo? And I think we've already started touching upon some of these things, but let's go deeper into it. Let's start with you now, Berenice.
The materials, I think anything that is there in front of you, just like I've done with a lot of different women, different murals. I did a mural with some women from Logan Heights, really amazing women, and Patricia Cruz was creating, you know, this event, and I came in and said, hey, why don't we create a 20-foot woman? And if we were to buy canvas, right, we couldn't afford that. But hey, we can get this rosin paper and duct tape and tape it up and make this huge thing and utilize what we have in front of us and create a presence, right? So I think in different communities in which I've been at, we are utilizing what they have. Part of my group, I have a indigenous artist, Jennifer Clay, and she uses leaves and things that are natural in people's environment, right? So I think it's really important and meaningful. For example, when I work with people through art therapy, it's really important when we utilize things that are broken or discarded, because the reframe of that is I'm creating something, I'm creating a counter story. And a lot of the clients that I work with, they believe there's something wrong with them or there's something broken. And when you take that broken material or that found material and you create something divine, then that's kind of a mirror on who they are, right? This piece that someone else can interact and ask the story, and most importantly, have the people of the artwork have a counter story, right, that is meaningful to them, that empowers them.
Thank you. I really like that. Create something divine out of something that's broken. And I think that's something we can all kind of connect to when we're creating art, or even as conservators, when we have damaged art and we're conserving and bringing it back. Faye, what's your, talking about the visual or aesthetic values presented through Rasquache and Rasquachismo.
Yeah, for sure. I think I would say a lot of the same, a lot of use of common items. You know, we're not talking about high art. A lot of times our Chicana work, and still to this day, is categorized to folk art, right? Is categorized to kind of that art that is what is seen maybe as lower in some way on a hierarchy. And so using, you know, contemporary thoughts, but being inventive. It might be items that are down the street right in front of you, such as Berenice said, you know, really anything that you can use, using kind of conventional items that we have in new ways and new connections. So one of the examples, you know, I really appreciated Berenice talking about like using house paint for stuff. Like, you know, we like Nova for muralists, you know, it's like Nova colors is like the certain one, which is an amazing thing. But like a lot of us, I'm not a muralist, but a lot of my friends and community members, when they started things, you know, they did it whatever they could, you know. When we started Mujeres and Maiz, we didn't know, we knew it was important what we were doing. And we knew we needed to document ourselves, you know, and I know in a little bit later, we're going to talk about documentation and kind of how to do that for your own group or for what you're doing. But we didn't know how to edit video, and there wasn't digital video back then, but we were like, we're going to figure it out. Let's ask our homegirl. Let's ask the homie who has the code to get into the MFA studios at UCLA, who's going to teach us 2 to 3 things on how to edit, and then we'll do it. Because it was like a brava aesthetic. So really at that point, we were using what was high tech then in 1999, video editing at the MFA UCLA film school, right? But we didn't know we were doing, we just knew whatever we could use. In my case, I have 2 different carts that are based on the elote carts, on the corn carts of our communities, of our barrios, right? And I use them in a little bit different way. So it's a conventional quote unquote item that our community, that our barrios see every single day, and that we love and we take for our street vendors and our communities. But it's using it to bring other types of information, usually really in an intervention style, because it's doing performance, projections, poetry. And then also another cart, which is a Botanica del Barrio, that uses the elote cart version to bring herbalism and medicine and ancestral remedies to communities, and really to validate our own knowledge, not to bring and say, oh, we know what we're doing, here it is, but to validate that so-called, right, even Rasquache information, connection, ideas, and conocimiento, or knowledge that we want to validate and we want to affirm to our community. So it really could be anything and anything, but it's usually what, you know, things that are cheaper, cheaper on the value, something that, you know, we're not having to go far for, and the stuff that's around us. So you'll see, you know, everything. I know what I really appreciate también, Amelia Mesapellans and others, Dr. Amelia Mesapellans and others also talking kind of like the woman, well, not women's, but with some energy of mujer version of Rasquachismo in the domesticana, and using whatever is around us in that case, like a makeup box, or it might be a toolbox, right? Depending on what kind of person we are and what our interest is. It's not always more like the femme aesthetics within domesticana, or like seen as domestic, but anything really.
Yeah, we let anything to this conversation as well.
You got cut off there a little bit. What did you say?
Oh, I was asking you to chime in on this conversation.
I really appreciate both of your insights into the idea of Rasquache, especially because you have lived experience and have created with your own hands and in your own communities, using the idea of Rasquache that, like Fe, I learned from as a formal name in college, but like Berenice, I was born into just as a matter of reality and the circumstance, right? So we grow up practicing environmental friendly practices without necessarily thinking we're going green. It is as a matter of necessity. But I really appreciate the conversation around Rasquachismo being a product of accessibility and resources. And it can be something that is done by choice, and it can also be something that is done out of necessity, right? So the idea, for example, that you used house paint to create a mural is at that moment access to whatever resources you could have to create the mural. But then we have to ask ourselves, in a moment, in some ideal moment in the future, when we have access to all of the resources and all of the best products and all of the best things, it is that moment when we choose to continue to use house paint, despite the fact that we have access to other resources, that Rasquachismo becomes a moment of resistance, right? That we acknowledge that the house paint has always been there for us in our moments of need, and we go back to that familiarity and we go back to that comfort area, because that is how we practice resilience, and that resilience then turns into resistance. And I love how both of you kind of wove your personal stories of your cards, Fe, and the murals, Berenice, into how that turns into practice. And definitely looking at Rasquachismo from a feminist lens through the Chicana, thinking again how we give different life to different objects and different materials, and breathe into them again as a moment of resistance, reappropriating them and reclaiming them and redefining them for our own powerful use. So thank you for that.
Thank you. So this is a perfect segue into our next question. So two big elements of Chicanx culture are resistance and affirmation. And can we talk about Rasquache as resistance and affirmation, and its resistance to what? And an affirmation of what? So Fe, let's start with you.
Yeah, I love this connection and question, because as an educator, you know, I'm always about like memory tools and like, what are the 4 R's or border Orfeh, and like resist, reclaim, you know, and like really trying to connect so that people are able not just to remember, like the students are connecting with Chicano art and Mesoamerican connections and spirituality, but they're also hoping to retain it and reconnect with it, right? So this one, I'm always like connected back to the exhibit, or one of the most important exhibits and key first important kind of seminal or germinating exhibits of Chicano art, which is Gara, right? Chicano art, resistance, and affirmation. And so it reminds me of that. And for me, we're resisting, you know, even then and now, and for 500 plus in many centuries, white heteropatriarchy, right? Colonialism, settler connections, and people overall were resisting male-led and white art spaces. In this case, oftentimes white galleries and museums, white walls and spaces, and that aesthetic overall. You know, lightness and whiteness that we see as like good and okay compared to what we are seeing often usually. So for me, resistance oftentimes is resisting that. And so, you know, purposely walking into a space, a connection with my Wipil, whether it's this Zoom or a classroom or, you know, an academic space, whatever it may be, I'm resisting that connection. I'm resisting that usual colonization of our communities, our language, our looks, everything, right? I thought I had hoops, but not hoops, but usually I'll have the hoops or red lipstick, right? These certain things that even that can be seen as maybe Rasquache. Do I look more chola or do I look more indigenous, right? Do I look like a professor? Do I look like an artist? Whatever it is, I'm resisting in some way, shape, or form. And for me, then therefore also affirming our brown bodies, affirming our brown art, our community art, our Rasquachismo, our Chicana, our abuelitas, our connection, all that beauty, right? In the bordados. Although a lot of these are like machine made these days, there's still like brown people selling them and bending them and connecting with them. So these traditions, really affirming the traditions, the colors, everything about us that was oftentimes put down about us, right? And so reconnecting that as much as we can, and really showing that in a good way, in a beautiful way, and saying that it's okay. And I think as you know, as an educator, it's so important to do that, and especially for young people. And so I think that's a really, really key thing, and something that I think is super key. Gracias.
Thank you. Berenice.
That was all really wonderfully said. When I think about resistance, I think about existence, right? I think about pushing and kicking down that door and say, I exist, right? And being able to have that platform, not only as women, right? But to be able to take up that space in the stories and the things that are important. I think, I love that idea, muralism in the 60s, where Mexicanos couldn't come into the gallery and then they would paint the mural across the street. Like, what? Right? I'm here. You cannot erase me. And then having those stories and those images be out there is so very important for our youth. Is so very important for us to see that representation. So I think, to make things happen regardless, right? I think as a person who didn't go to art school and who is self-taught, I think it's important to keep doing that artwork and to do it big and loud and to invite other people to do it and to encourage community people to do it. As an art therapist, I invite people who don't think they're artists to create big pieces of art. And I think all those things are really important because, if you're only going to call yourself an artist because you went to the best schools or because you're in the best galleries, that's not necessarily true. How do you utilize your art as an expression, as a resistance of, I am here, I'm not going anywhere, right? Like with undocumented students, I'm here, I'm going to pop up in your school and I'm going to annoy you so that you could see me. And I think that's the most important part for me.
Thank you. I think what I'm hearing like throughout this is Rasquache is not asking for nor waiting for this institutional approval, and it exists in community, and it's for community by community. And how can you define it within current, I think, art historical museum gallery space hierarchy? Like you even mentioned, it's seen as lower folk art, but then you have now contemporary museums collecting this. So these are really interesting conversations to be happening at this point in time, especially with everyone seems to be collecting BIPOC art nowadays. Leticia, I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I agree with everything that has been said. I think for me, when I think about resistance and affirmation and how Rasquachismo works in that space, I think that Rasquachismo is defiance. I think it lives in resistance to Eurocentric notions of excellence and beauty, and it resists molding and fitting into a box that has already defined art as this is what belongs in an institution, this does not, right? So Chicano art belongs in institutions, but it doesn't belong in institutions because it decided to shake off its Rasquachismo and conform into some Eurocentric notion of excellence and beauty so that it could be a part of it. If anything, when Chicano art is able to expand the American canon and is able to come in as it is, as you mentioned, Bianca, increasingly, finally, long overdue doing these days, right? You walk into a contemporary art gallery and you see amongst the works of all of these other pieces, a piece of Rasquache art that is made out of discarded material and repurposed, your mom's cortinas and the margarine tub and all of these things. And what more defiance is there than you try to cut off our resources, through structural institutional racism. You left us with little to make do with. And yet here we created this piece and it is here in your white walls, in your galleries, and it belongs here and it expands your definition of what art is. What a beautiful defiance that is. So we can think of Rasquachismo in really simple terms, as an aesthetic, as an amalgamation of different objects and things and materials that create any kind of given piece, two-dimensional or three-dimensional, but we can also think of Rasquachismo as identity in and of itself, and very definitive of Chicano and Chicana identity as a mode of resistance and an affirmation of aquí estamos y no nos vamos, and we are not going to comply and we are not going to mold ourselves to some other notion of excellence when we are excellent already.
Thank you. So now let's move into Rasquache as materiality and process. We've talked about Rasquache as what we see and what we produce, but what about Rasquache as how we produce and what we produce it with? What are some of the material choices and particular artistic processes present in Rasquache art? And I know Berenice has already talked about using resin paper and house paint, and let's delve deeper into this. So let's start with you, Berenice.
I think one of the things that I think about the process piece is that I never know what I'm doing. I act like I know what I'm doing, but I never know. And I think that that idea of doing it anyway, just show up, see what happens, let's make mistakes, let's experiment, let's just create something new because we don't necessarily have that information or that education or even that support sometimes. So I think even that process allows for a lot of creativity and a lot of things that we wouldn't have never have thought about. And I think within my girl gang, my art group of women, they're all very talented, right? And they all have a lot of knowledge. But in looking at, hey, okay, I don't know how to do it, but I'm gonna do it. But I'm gonna go for this grant, or I'm gonna put my hat into the circle, or I'm just gonna, talk about this. I think it is really important because we all have that idea that we are not good enough, or imposter syndrome. And I read something the other day where they're talking about imposter syndrome, and it was a woman who was saying, don't fight it. Just pretend that when you show up, you're showing up to somebody's wedding and you're crashing it. So you know what? Screw it. Go ahead and dance and drink all the drinks and eat all the food and have the most fun that you possibly can. And I love that because I feel like that a lot as a woman muralist artist in all kinds of places, of course. And it's like, I'm here. You may not like it, but I'm here and I'm going to figure something out.
Thank you. I'm going to forever think about imposter syndrome as crashing a wedding from now on. That's fabulous. Faye, what's your?
Yes, right on. I'll keep going like, yes, Leticia,
Yeah.
Bernice, and all of you like sharing. I'm feeling you all. And yeah, I agree. I mean, there's so many different literally objects or items and material choices. My work is more performance and poetry oriented, and one of my other pieces or some of my other artwork, which is never considered artwork, is actually organizing and creating space for other people to create. And I've done that, since 25 years ago when Mujeres and Maiz started, and we're honoring and connecting with our 25th anniversary this year, 2022. And so we, again, didn't know what we were doing, but we were like, we got to do it. We didn't know how to do an event, but we decided to do a multimedia art organizing exhibit, show, performance, concert, festival, marketplace, right? And we did all that because we just wanted to. We didn't know how to do it. We just figured it out along the way. So a lot of it is, again, connections, comadrismo, the homie network, right? Like somebody who knew how to do the video that I had mentioned before, somebody who knew how to help us with Photoshop back then and use the Mac when it was like, looked very, very different and we had no idea what we were doing. But, all these people who helped or connected or shared their conocimiento and their information. And it was this giving hand, giving information and sharing what but also asking of others and us lending a hand and also bringing the hand up. So asking people to come back and support the communities and circles and us doing that already. So when we think of it in terms of my work and a lot of the work that was a little bit more performance oriented, we do things in the street. I do performances or interventions, protests, performances, prayers, all of those, like whatever you want to call them, they are all of those things at the same time. And it's also seen as art, performance art, if I call it that, and if somebody sees it. And once I take a picture of it, I can also put it up and conserve it, right? And film it and document. I know we're going into that a little bit later, but then I do that and it also becomes another type of art piece, and it can be seen from many other people who didn't see that quick intervention of 5 minutes in the streets of LA, right? So when I think of some of the work on our street interventions and our performances and prayers that we do in circles and spaces, a lot of it is around protest and organizing and advocacy. A lot of it is also honoring and prayer, and in conjunction with our indigenous relatives who are the rightful caretakers and often, of unceded land in their community. In my case, a Tongva territory, and working with some of the Tongva community here, or when we're in ceremony or other spaces, Kumeyaay and other locations, depending on where we're at. But we also think about like the 60s and 70s, and a lot of the Chicana artists then, our predecessors are people like Osco. They did it a little bit differently, their street interventions, and what like Mujeres and Maiz or myself work bring a lot more of, in my case, what I think that might be different is like the spirit-led work and the prayer work in that. Like we might do it on the streets and even inside of the islands of the street, just like them, but it's a little different in the way we do it. And mine was also like sent, like my performance at one point was sent to the United Nations as an example of, because it was a request for people to drum or sing or use their sacred instruments wherever they could, and send a picture and send it so that we can honor the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples drip and honor it across the world. So me doing something like that was Rasquache, was a la brava, but it was also this prayer for me and for many others. It was an honoring of the streets of the community of the Tongva territory, but it was also a protest, and it also honored, right, Allah or Allah mode or Allah, the idea of Osco, but in a different way. So, it's the simple way, the quick way, the crude way, the way that I just said, we got to do it. I did it. And like an hour or two later, we were there doing it, right? It was because it had to be done. And a lot of it is on our urgency. I feel like Mujeres and Maiz and my work is oftentimes on, Berenice said we're not sure what we're doing. Like we know because we're led by heart and spirit, and we have to do it oftentimes. And in the end, like, was that great artistically? Did we get a good documentation of it so that we can have a good photograph to eventually be years later, maybe in an art exhibit? Like that's not our first thought. It should be my first thought, but honestly, it's not. It's like oftentimes the last thought for me. And that's part of, I know we're going to talk about, like sometimes my issues is documenting it and finding like good people to document these things so that we can eventually have it conserved for years. Again, my work is a little bit, and a lot of our Mujeres and Maiz work is a little bit ephemeral in terms of like, you see it, you don't see it. And we're so involved in it that oftentimes we don't have the time, even though we know we need to document and do that, we don't have the time and capacity to. So hopefully that's where we get more support in a lot of ways, and that's one of the asks a little bit later.
Thank you. That was a perfect segue for some of the conversations that are just about to follow up. But I'm just really struck with how Rasquache is it's not just an aesthetic, it really is a way of doing. And it can apply to so many things, like your prayers. That kind of blows my mind a little bit right now. So let's move on to material choices and processes, the conserving intent. We've learned a lot about Rasquachismo today and how it guides cultural production in more than an aesthetic way. It may dictate materials and processes, and this is something that's very important when it comes to our conservation and preservation. We're going to now sort of steer the conversation towards Morgan, who's going to tell us a little bit about what role materials play in the process of conservation. So Morgan, as we've been discussing, Rasquachismo is just one of the many approaches to Chicanese cultural production, and what Rasquachismo stands for is also present in so many ways in many other cultural collections. So it's not just Chicanx art who's making do with what they have, it's so many other communities who are underrepresented in so many of our cultural institutions. One thing in common is the use of a wide variety of materials. So tell us a little bit about your experience as an art conservator working with different types of materials.
Okay, so while I specialize in paintings conservation and painted objects, I'm trained to look at all kinds of different artwork and cultural heritage objects. And whenever I'm looking at something, I kind of approach it in the same way and ask the same questions. What is this artwork made out of? How is it put together? And I look for condition issues, like, is this artwork stable, or does it look like it's about to come apart, or are there little things missing from it? So those are kind of the questions I ask no matter what. But the difference between different materials are often how we carry out conservation treatments or how we preserve them. So while a conservator might clean a piece of porcelain with like a water-based cleaning solution, that same solution on a metal might cause corrosion. So we don't want to do that. So we need to understand the difference in materials that we're working on, but also materials that we're using during the treatment. And whether it's the objects themselves or the things we use in treatment, or even the materials that storage is made out of, or the paint on the walls that it's displayed out of, those play a huge role in our decision-making processes. But other differences are more like philosophical ones about goals and preservation and treatment options for the future. So with some kind of objects, like especially old ones, if we're thinking about ancient pottery or mosaics or different, even architecture, we're kind of used to seeing them look old. And in our minds, it's okay if there are things missing, like these are old, they're supposed to look old. And so we kind of accept that as part of the object. But maybe in newer things or things that are in a museum, we expect them to look pristine. We don't expect to see like a hole in a Monet, even though all objects have a lifespan and all of them are susceptible to damage. And so how we preserve and treat objects is also kind of partially decided by our aesthetic goals and expectations as a society.
Yeah, you've touched upon this idea of like values. You know, we have newness value, but you also have age value, and in a way they can both coexist in a piece, but it's also, they're very much at odds. And that's when talking to the artist and the documentation process can play such a critical role in informing not only us conservators, but also the institution. You know, you have your registrars and they'll freak out if something's falling off a piece, but is it okay for it to be falling off the piece?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So how would you approach a piece of mixed media work differently than, say, a stretched oil on canvas? What are some of the challenges with conserving mixed media materials?
Usually I like to take a bit more time to look at a mixed media piece because there can be a lot going on, a lot of different materials and different ways that they're put together. And so that just off the front kind of takes a bit more time. And then one of the kind of biggest challenges of working with mixed media pieces is just that sometimes the materials that are used don't always play nice with each other. You've got paper next to wood, and the wood is off-gassing onto the paper, and that's causing it to yellow faster than it would be if it was just sitting by itself. Or the glue that was used wasn't meant to hold the weight of something that was so heavy that was holding it onto something. And so we're looking at all of those different aspects of the artwork and trying to understand what was kind of the intention, the goal here, and how do we want to preserve it for the future. Also, a lot of these different materials like to be in different environments. So let's say paper objects are most stable with like a room kind of like a very nice 50% relative humidity, whereas the metal object actually likes it a bit drier. Like, what materials do we privilege when we make that decision? Do we kind of average it out, or who's going to be made the happiest on this material? Or do we like cater to the ones that are kind of most sensitive of the object? So those are things I think about and are kind of the most challenging when thinking about preservation of mixed media.
Thank you. I see Berenice and Fez like heads like, oh my gosh. So I've already kind of alluded to this, but talking about the ethics of conservation and preserving more than the object, it's about preserving the artist's intent. So how can documentation of the artist's materials, processes, and intent can aid in the future conservation of works? So Morgan, what are some details about a work that would be beneficial for a conservator to know when examining or treating a work of art, and how and why do these help?
Well, the way I think about it is just the more information we have about how an object was made, what it was made out of, your thoughts about preservation or intention or any of these things, the more options we're going to have in the future. And so it's just more information. And I'm talking about even really specific things like what brand of paint did you use? Because paint companies put all kinds of different things in depending on their like proprietary recipes, and what glue did you use, and like even like what was the temperature that day, like all of these different things might like play a role in the future. And it might seem like a lot, but you know, writing down not only materials but also your thoughts about how you want this to be kind of seen or displayed or preserved in the future, those are really important things that we need to take into consideration going forward, because everything breaks down over time, and that, you know, is true from the weather, like the environment that's in, or anything like acute damage that could happen to it, like I don't know, if somebody runs into it, all of these different things that we see. So it's good to think about how you would address these things in the future. Hopefully, in most scenarios, people would reach out to you and have a conversation. So all of these things that you're writing down or recording in some way are not necessarily going to be set in stone. You can change your mind in the future. Let's say like you've thought about it, and maybe at first you really like the idea of your art being pristine, but like going forward, actually, I really like the wear that it has. It's telling its story. And there's a lot of like history in that, the way that this has been aged or brought together over time. And so it's, you know, what you're saying doesn't have to be the final say, but you know, it helps people in the future understand how to fix things, how to work with you on different things. And so I think that's one of the really great reasons to record these, and for your own personal collection or archive, but also to have conversations with the people who are displaying your art, whether it's in your community or if you're, you know, recording it in a different way, who you're sharing it with, like let these things be known. And so that we have the best chance of preserving your art on your terms and not the terms of someone else.
Thank you. That last sentence was just so perfect. It really has to be on the artist's terms. I want to share more like an anecdote of personal experience working on an artist piece, and I'm a painting conservator. I was cleaning this painting, and I noticed that the bottom half was covered in like fuzz. It was like fuzzy, linty, something like that. It turned out it was cat hair. It was covered in cat hair. And I was working with my supervisor, and I asked her about, okay, we should remove these, right? It's fuzzy, like it's really distracting. And she was explaining, no, it's the artist's cat. The artist, like the cat is in the artist studio all the time. And as she is painting, the cat kind of becomes part of the painting process. And the hair of the cat embedded in the painting is part of the painting now. And that's how the artist wants it. So not knowing these anecdotes, if they're not recorded somewhere, how will someone ever know that you're not supposed to remove the cat hair from a painting? That just seems, you know, anyone would just go ahead and do it, but it's meant to stay with it. It's part of it. There's a spiritual process to painting with the cat in the studio, and the cat hair needs to stay on the painting. Considering the importance of documentation and artistic processes, what are some guiding points that you can impart on artists, cultural producers, etc., to better position them and their work to be preserved? And this question is now for both Fe and Berenice to kind of reflect on this and share back with us. So let's start with Fe.
Sure, it's so interesting. You know, I don't think much of that part. I think because we're so ephemeral and like a la brava and Rasquachismo, and we know we need to document, but we're not thinking very much about, we are thinking about the future and the 7 generations beyond, but not necessarily how like that piece or that information should be retained or specifically like museum wise, or even, you know, as Mujeres and Maiz, we have started to look out for and think about our where our collection is going to be, you know, where our information, where is our zines, where are our meeting notes, which are now on Google Docs, right? So like where back in the day we had papers, and we still have those, all those flyers. When we had our 20th anniversary exhibit in the museum, it was a museum that asked us a lot of questions that we were like, not really ready for or used to. I think we're maneuvering a lot more into that, even though many of us are, have graduate degrees or even PhDs in different things as a crew and as a circle of women of color artists and wellness practitioners and educators. We still have a lot of work to do in this section. But what I always want to say is that, and what I've learned is to always photograph and document your work, right? Video it, even if at the minimum on your phone, right? Not even a lot of us, I know most, that's not required, that's not requested. I'm always, as the administrator and arts administrator and curator, asking for high res, right? And I get not that by most Chicano artists because of what we don't have. We don't have the access to good photographs or somebody to take the photographs correctly in the way that it should be with the lighting that it should be, right? So I'm saying at least do it, and at least do it at this case, with phones and smartphones, we have the access to it a little bit better. Of course, we would want it to do it to a whole nother level if you can. But for example, our performances, I am always like calling a photographer, can you come? Like, can you come? Can we hook it up? It's usually not paid in any way. I'm like, oh, we'll trade this. I'll do this for, figuring it out for them to be there. Again, it's an a la brava Rasquache way, but that's the way like we do it in our communities, or at least that we've done. So inviting people to do that, that's really saved me a lot in a lot of my recent work and some of my individual personal work when I started doing stuff away from the collective, really inviting people to videotape it, 2 to 3 people to videotape or photograph it. Even my goddaughter, my diosa daughter, who was like learning how to photograph, like all these different levels, so that we're bringing in a team again of people who are learning the process and learning why we have to do this. So it's a mentorship, even without really officially saying it. And also one of the big things for us, because a lot of it is digital, our PDFs of our zines from 1997, like we have to try to PDF them now and do it in the correct way, photographing work, etc. We're trying to save it on various platforms. Again, it's very different from the visual artwork or like a painting or object, but saving it on different platforms. So not only like a Google Drive, a Dropbox, then having a hard drive and having 3 different hard drives, one of them in a safe, and I only got that because my photography teacher at Otis Art School, right? MFA, this is like, she's like, I have it here, 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 and here. And I'm like, oh, that's why I don't have things from 10 years ago. You know what I mean? Because they are out of date now. Like we have like, 8 tracks, or we have like a floppy disk from our 1997 work, right? So putting it on all these drives, all these places, and then also even the collections, talking about libraries or universities or spaces that will look at your collection or consider it, it has to be at a certain level of that case. So Mujeres and Maiz is looking at which ones we want to do it and where and why, and what are their capacities, and are they going to make it accessible to the community or not, right? So we're thinking about a lot of that. In terms of like, what Morgan was mentioning a little bit, and I was learning a lot from both you, Bianca, that cat thing like blew my mind. I would say like, no, because the audience is going to get allergic like me. So
that would just be part of the experience of watching the
right?
He just needs.
That's, I mean, I guess if the artist said that, but if the artist didn't, I don't know, I would probably want it clean. I'm like, I didn't want that in my work. It just happened. But anyway. But when I thought of that, I thought about when I brought my carts to a museum, the Shrem Museum at UC Davis. And, they had, my work is interactive. It's supposed to have workshops at it. It has herbs in it. People are supposed to touch it. And that sometimes blows like museums' minds. They're like, how do you do that? What do we do? Like, how do we do that? What's going to happen? What rules do we have to do? What's our insurance? Like, and then the herb part was really key too, because one of the workshops has like herbs, and it should always have herbs, right? Or it should have these things next to it at a time. So then that comes into animals, like what could come in, and the animals next to the other, like really conserved art that should be conserved and not touched and shouldn't have animals by it. So it became, I always, I think, bring like little challenges, I think, to museums and spaces. But again, that's oftentimes because a lot of our work isn't meant to be there. Like those carts are supposed to be in the street, and that's where their home is, and that's where their vision and audience is always. But I do live in different worlds, and the work lives in different worlds. So it's okay to go into the museum world, but then there it has a lot of different challenges and spaces. So I think it's always like something to think about, something to definitely. I love the, asking the artist, and now I'm really considering like for all my stuff to like have some kind of Google Doc or thing that's attached to it inside that says like all of that. That really has that, because I don't know most artists who do that or have that, and whether they're exhibiting at high level or community art spaces, I don't really know. I'm not taught to do that. I've never thought of that to that level. So I appreciate you'll both sharing that and kind of imparting your wisdom on that keynote and key part that we should be thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you. I keep reflecting on these like little different nuggets of information throughout all these questions, and I sense like this idea keeps coming of like the inside outside, how like Rasquache exists outside. It's like a community language, like visual language and mode and way of being and doing, and then how it can, when it goes into institutions and museums, galleries, spaces, indoor spaces, there's a tension there. It like not just the concept, but even the actual physical materiality of it, and whether it belongs inside the institution or not. Just a thought I was having about it. Berenice, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, my mind was just blown with Morgan and breaking things down and things I've never really even thought about. And I've been doing art for over 20 years as well. And I think what really I'm left with is this idea that back in the day, of course, I didn't have the resources, right, to document things. But then that idea of like, why would I document something if as a Chicana muralist or artist, I was never validated? Like no one ever told me, yes, I would love your art and I would love to have it somewhere. Like there's this part of me like, wow, would that even happen? And I think the other part too is that accessibility, right? Like I'm always in chinga. Like, even now it's like, oh my goodness, how do I finish this? And we have this. And, even with my girl gang, it's like, oh, we have like 3 jobs and we're trying to do this whole installation and community engagement. And hey, you didn't bring the glue. What else can we use? Oh, that doesn't work. What can we use? And it's this like manic and frantic get it done kind of situation. And then when we're working in the community, we're doing art psychotherapy, which by the way, I haven't told you what that is. I think when I tell people that I'm an art therapist, people think that I carry coloring books and a jug of wine. And it's a lot more than that, right? I mean, it's a psychological process using art in order to create new neural networks in your brain so you can make change. And because it's really an interesting subconscious process, it's healing and it's sacred. And so that idea that we would record that is like wanting to record a ceremony or wanting to record something that is very private. And so that trips me out a little bit, like, oh, well, and it's an experience, right? And it's a process. And at the same time, now that, I've got my PhD, which I don't recommend anyone doing, but when I went through this whole process, I realized that it was so important to document, right? That I got this degree so that I could write, so that I could have a voice, that the pen is mighty as the paintbrush, right? And so, now, within this group XoQUE, like Faye was saying, you got the person who's good at social media or the person who knows this other person and the homegirl connection, right? And I think that we are just trying our very best to document. I never in my mind thought about what brand of paint because really I think that as Chicano artist and that Rasquache, we're just utilizing what we have in front of us. And we really are being so creative. Can we use this? And with community engagement too, it's really important to be able to have that open mind. I wasn't planning on that, but let me invite you. I didn't know you were going to bring that, but let's utilize it. Or how do we empower a community or have the community give us their knowledge, right? And so I wish that I just was an artist, didn't have a job, although I love my job, right? What I dedicate myself to. Or even if I could hire, if anyone out there wants to hang out and document, please let me know. We will feed you, you'll have a good time, and we can hang out, we'll do some art therapy. But like, I don't have anyone to do that. So I guess I'm just trying my best, and I'm really excited that you're telling me this because I had no idea.
Um, thank you. Yeah, I think like you've mentioned, like sometimes we just get to the site, you forgot the glue. Well, what can we use? We'll staple it up. And then what happens is that years from then, say like this piece is preserved, then Morgan and I come in and we're asked to preserve, conserve, restore this piece. And we see that staple that you used instead of the glue. And then we're going to start overthinking, well, what is the significance of this staple? And you're laughing, but this is a very serious issue for us. So it really is that the importance of the documentation. It's about understanding for us what your intent was. So is it about the actual material that you used? No, that was maybe an accident and it has no importance and no bearing in the overall meaning of this piece. Or is it about what it's important for you is to preserve the essence, the looks? So it, like materials can have meaning and can be really important. And we're always trying to be very conscious about that. So in preserving the piece, what are we trying to preserve? Is it the physical materiality of it in its original state? Or is it just the essence and the concept, and can it be done with other materials? So that's how we approach and why it's important for us to have an artist documentation. And I think Leticia really wants to chime in here.
Can you tell?
Yeah.
My mind is also blown both by the knowledge imparted by Morgan and Bianca on the importance of conservation and documentation, and then obviously your own stories of your work and your community impact. And I'm thinking, as I'm hearing both of you talk about, both of you, Berenice and Fe, talk about how we are constantly in motion and there's no moment to pause. And this idea of stopping long enough to document is a luxury we don't have. And I am reminded of last week's session. We had a session and our focus was consafos, and Maria Figueroa, after we talked about conservation and we talked about consafos as self-preservation and healing, Maria said this really beautiful comment where she looked at conservation through a Chicana lens and thought of conservation as a pause, a rest, and a moment to reflect. And this kind of merging of these two worlds that are now mine, right? My Chicana-ness and now being in the field of conservation and thinking of conservation really as a luxury. And we talk about this all the time, right? Who has access to these services? Who has access to these conversations? I mean, I literally get to like sit like this all day with my hard eyes and watch Morgan and Bianca and our colleagues at BACC talk about these things. And I feel selfish because I know that our communities could be impacted and could do so much with these tools, even thinking about how they apply to us and our Chicano community and how we can grow and how we can help preserve. And I'm brought to this moment of thinking about Chicana futurism and what Berenice, you mentioned that when you were producing your work, it's hard for you to think of the value of documentation when you're not being validated as a mujer or as a Chicana, as an artist. So what is the point? Right, but if we can imagine in our futurism selves, imagine a world, hopefully not 7 generations from now, hopefully sooner than that, where we are controlling our own spaces and we have our own walls to claim, that our works that we are creating now are being preserved and are being exhibited and digested in the way that we meant them to be, right? So this idea of pausing long enough to protect our stories and protect our intent becomes all the more powerful, so that we are not just creating for the sake of creating, but we are really creating to tell our stories for all of the following generations. So I'm so inspired by all 4 of you, and I'm so lucky and blessed to be in conversation with you right now. That is all.
Thank you, Leticia. We're all so lucky to have you too. So as we're wrapping this up, I want to share some final thoughts. In the last year, BACC has begun what promises to be a radical and transformative shift as we center our community to equity and inclusion as the core of our new identity. Our commitment to nourish cultural equity and inclusion and the use of the arts as a vehicle to do so positions the important work of art conservation and cultural preservation as an integral part of this success. As the only regional conservation center in the Western region, BACC has a responsibility to foster deep-seated change in both conservation as a professional field and in the access and impact that conservation knowledges of impact of conservation knowledges from communities historically underrepresented in museum collections and the American cultural canon. BACC is committed to shifting the way that regional conservation centers engage with collections and communities. We are putting this vision into practice through intentional, inclusive conservation programs, which will extend access and services, as well as by supporting training and education opportunities. Partnering with stewards of community cultural collections, expanding the existing knowledge base to include culturally conscious and responsive methods to conservation. So all these conversations are taking us in that direction. And dialoguing with artists and caretakers of diverse cultural heritage and ancestral collections. This program, these conversations mark the beginning of the road to inclusion. And as final thoughts, what are some ways that the field of conservation, BACC, and organizations like this can help support preservation efforts for the Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx community? So, Fe.
Yes. So do things like today, have these type of events, invite people and different people to talks like this, have these different conversations, connections, and spaces. Advocate in other art spaces and those spaces that you walk in that we are not a part of, like those conservation circles and spaces, conferences, museums, right? To talk about what you've learned, what you connected, or what your own, some of the different things that we're thinking about, I think is really key because we're not represented, or at least us personally are not a different type of artist. I think also museum spaces, buy our art, show the art, promote or post the art, repost, those types of things, very basic stuff of advocating in whatever way you can. And so I think this program and series and today is a beautiful example of that. So I super appreciate the invitation and thank you.
Berenice.
Yeah, I want to thank you for today. I mean, I learned so much and I agree with what Faye is saying. I mean, I can imagine like an academy or some kind of workshop series, that is available to everyone. Like I would love to just pick your brains and hang out and maybe have lunch. I'm actually a fun person and, get this information and disseminate it. Right, far and wide and early on, because as an artist that I was just starting, that was not something that was on my radar, and it's just barely becoming something. So I think having those feelers out, making those connections, and then cross-pollinating it all throughout. And yes, Faye, buy our art. Yes, come to our galleries. Support us Chicanas. In the grind. But I think just more accessibility and visibility.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's really important to acknowledge the fact that this is new for conservation. Conservation has been so deeply rooted in like academia and the museum world and this like highly educated elite sort of scholarly knowledge. And going back to like now that we're expanding and museums are collecting, people are buying, there's more visibility. It's how can we best preserve your art, your artistic production, your cultural heritage, and how can we better understand it from a lens that goes beyond this traditional material approach to, like Western, like European white art. There are obviously different notions like aesthetics, ways of making and doing that are not applicable to, say, like a 17th century Italian painting. That would be a completely different set of values and ways of producing and what maybe the artist wanted it to look like and what the message was. So this kind of goes back to the issue of increasing diversity and representation in the field of conservation. We need more conservators who are themselves from underrepresented backgrounds, who understand these communities and who can speak about and to this art and to the community, back to the community, and serve as bridge makers. So thank you so much for the two of you for joining us here today. We have some time and I want to open the floor for questions. So I mean like questions, if you, Berenice or Fe, want to ask, or even the audience, everyone's welcome to ask questions that might relate to conservation. So Morgan and I are here as resources. If there's anything that you're curious about, your own work or in general, feel free. Now is the time.
I always like to hear from the audience because I'm used to kind of moving with people, and Zoom is not necessarily, it cuts us off. I just wonder what people think, right? Or, I just would love to hear if anyone has questions about that, because again, this kind of blew my mind in that that's not something that I was ever taught, something that has to be translated. Like Faye was saying, like her performance pieces, what she's doing is very organic. And, how do you transfer that or keep that, or how do we do this? And then also just that philosophical kind of delving in, right? I love what you were saying about the cat hair, and I remember Leticia invited me to a show, and it was so exciting for me. And I remember I'm like, yeah, just stick it up. However, and Leticia's like, what do you mean? I'm like, yeah, I gotta go. I got a client. Just put it up there. It doesn't matter, And it's interesting, that idea of what was the purpose. I'm like, to get it up. But I think that story probably needs to be told in many different ways, right? The way that you tell it to yourself, the way that you're telling it to your community, but then to really kind of look at this other place that story would need to be told in a different way.
Yeah. And when we're looking at art, even though with the mounting, like we look at evidence of history of use. How was this handled? How was it displayed previously? Like, how is it supposed to be? Like, these are all things that we're always like, it's like CSI. We're looking at the art and looking for these little traces of evidence. So having the input from the artist would be greatly beneficial to have an accurate. So we're not kind of like coming up with these like mental stories of, well, it was maybe this or it was maybe that.
We always appreciate it when there's something on the back of the canvas that says, do not varnish, or like, got it, thank you.
Yes, that is the best way to do it. See, the chat is pretty quiet at the moment, so.
Maybe Morgan and Bianca, if you could give us 5 details or X amount of details that every artist should document when creating a piece. What are some of the most, like, just super basic? I know you talked about it like in narrative form, but just dwindle it down to like bullet points. Like, these are the things that you should write on the back of your canvas or on the side of your piece when you make a piece, because 500 years when the conservator is looking at it, this is what's going to save them the headache and going to make sure that they conserve it to your intent.
Materials. I don't want to have to like test your surface to guess or make an inferred guess what it could possibly be. And I'll let Morgan have her 5.
Obviously, materials are really important, but we want to know what's most important to you. Like Bianca was saying before, some things might matter to one artist so much, like how it's framed or how it's displayed, like that is an integral part of the piece. But to another artist, it really doesn't matter. But the fact that it's not shiny is really important to them. All these different things. And so the more that you can write down kind of the essence of what you want preserved, or like we were kind of talking about earlier, if the ephemerality or the degradation of these materials over time are important to the artwork, we want to know that, and we don't want to preserve it if you don't want it to be preserved. We want to, take the artist's input and preserve it on those terms. And so, any of the, I mean, that gets kind of long for writing on the back of a canvas, I grant you. But however you can kind of keep that with the artwork, because, or maybe you don't know, but, legally, even after you've finished an artwork and it's owned by someone else, especially in the state of California, it's really important that people are not using your artwork or preserving it in ways that they're not supposed to, or are not intended through the California Artist Protection Act. So that's something to look at as well. And I mean, regardless of the law, it's, philosophically something that we're really aligned with, and we want to make sure that art is preserved the way that it was sort of meant to be, or not preserved the way it was meant to be.
Someone wrote in the chat, keeping artist journal, and that's a great idea. It also reminds me that we do a lot of artist interviews, and oftentimes we will record these interviews, whether it's an audio or a video. And it's really interesting sometimes when an artist is interviewed at different stages of their life, and how their ideas for even the same piece evolves over time, because their own artistic practice and ideas also change over time. So I can see also these points of contention when maybe the artist in a previous moment said, this is what this means to me and what I really want to preserve the most out of it. And then later on in your career, you have a different vision for it. So even that, the documentation of that thought process, I think is very informative and important. And something to really think about. Yeah. Well, if there's any more questions in the chat or from the two of you, Leticia, you want to say something?
No, I was going to mention that we should have a do not resuscitate form for artworks that are not.
Yeah, absolutely. That there should be a do not resuscitate form. It's happened. There's definitely very famous cases, and I keep thinking of a strange fruit, and the name of the artist escapes my mind, but that's a kind of like a classic conservation example where it was an installation of fresh fruit that was meant to rot, and there was an attempt made to preserve the fruit in its state, and it defeated the whole concept of the piece, right? It's meant to go away, but that also poses a collecting challenge, right? As an institution who acquires this piece, what do you do with an installation that rotted away? Or do you keep like reinstalling fruit that just goes through the natural process? So conceptual art definitely poses probably one of the bigger challenges. And but that, I think people are more used to documenting the artist's process, ideas, things like that for conceptual art. And so if we start doing that for the rest of the art, that would be fantastic. So I'm going to wrap it up for today. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Berenice. Thank you, Fe, for joining us. Thank you to everyone in the audience. This was our second of 4 panels, and we hope to see you all next week, next Thursday at the same time for our next topic. And thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all. Blessings. Take care.
Also, a thank you to the California Humanities for funding this very important program, and to the City of San Diego Commission for Arts and Culture.
Thank you. We need the acknowledgement line.